Welcome back to the Sapphic Gaze podcast. I am your host, Nisa, and with me today is my guest host and friend from the Sapphic Book Club, Alex. Alex, how's it going?
It's going. Happy to be here.
So, you are now the third person from our book club that I've had on here. Christina and Kelsey, previous to you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I read a lot of books. I am a former preschool teacher. I have a degree in philosophy and a minor in history.
That actually is a really great segue into what our segment is today, which is Sapphics in historical fiction, or in history in general.
Well, it's one of those things where it's hard to talk about this without also talking about how queer women have been often erased from history, just by virtue of us not being particularly noteworthy or important. You know, in a patriarchal society, even in those with like pretty strict prohibitions on, for example, male homosexuality, you don't see a whole lot of like laws or even citations historically about queer women, because ultimately it's a patriarchal phallocentric kind of mindset that underpins a lot of history prior to the advent of feminism and feminist narratives.
That is really interesting, because as far as I have researched and been able to tell, is to your point, is I didn't recall seeing a lot of mentions of laws regarding sapphic queer people. It was always about homosexual men.
Yeah, because, and certainly adultery between men and women was a big thing in a way that it was not between women, because, you know, there's no questions of legitimacy or pregnancy. It was mostly just being damned to being unimportant.
Is that really where all of those laws just came from, is the fact that they were worried about illegitimate children? But then it's interesting to see the queer men and having those laws against homosexual males.
There are a lot of those narratives that you see even today in like sort of more reactionary feminist circles, this idea of like, you know, phallocentrism, that like the penis, as it were, is a contagion, that it's an instrument of patriarchal will or whatever, that when misused in the case of queer men or used against targets that are not within patriarchal and like patrimonial structures, in the case of adultery, or when absent in the case of lesbians, or the big thing is that when you look at narratives around queer men and specifically bisexual women, you see the same kind of thing come up in opposite ways, where like bisexual women are often implied to be like really straight, and queer, especially bisexual men, are often implied to be really gay, so that you have this erasure of whatever spectra within their sexuality because of phallocentrism. I've been reading Enemy Feminisms by Sophie Lewis, and she talks about some of these narratives, and as always, shout out to Julia Serrano, who writes about specifically trans women in a very nuanced and well thought out way. Like on the topic of historical romance, I have some like very big thoughts, I guess. I mean, the big one being that like when we talk about history, we're not talking about like what happened, because what happened is not always clear. The thing that we're talking about more is how we talk about what happened, the narratives that we use culturally.
Okay, I'm gonna have to ask you to elaborate on.
Sure. I mean, like, when you look at kind of the way that we understand history, we're all presented it with a specific narrative. And that's why a lot of history in the United States, especially when you look at public education, there's this battle over narratives, over whose voices are represented, over, you know, what stories are told. And the way that you frame an event like that is the way that we understand it. You're going to get a very different thing from like the MAGA curriculum versus Howard Zinn.
True. I guess to that point, thinking about like sapphic literature, I don't feel like there's a lot that has been shared like from those periods that are less modern. I know they exist, but they don't seem as prevalent as all the other narratives that exist.
Of course.
Do you have any part in particular that come from a bit of a different time period?
I have a couple. I know that there's one that's like basically fantasy that's supposed to be set in like the Bronze Age British Isles, which I'm not exactly thrilled about reading, but we'll see. It's on my list. They're called When Women Were Warriors. It's set during like a sort of druidic era. I have a couple of medieval books I've read. One of them is a retelling of Robin Hood with a ton of anachronisms, but that's still okay because it's kind of fun.
I guess, do you have any that you know of that were published back in the day?
Back in the day, I don't have any like published books from. I mean, like the earliest book that you can point to as like a modern kind of lesbian novel is probably The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall.
Oh.
That came out in the 20s, and it's very much of its time, and it's extraordinarily self-loathing. She hates herself, and there's a lot of weird sexual politics within it. The main character is a butch woman who identifies as the contemporarily understood sexual invert. That's what she calls herself. Her love interest for most of the book is a much more feminine woman. And of course, at the end, she cheats on her girlfriend to, I mean, yeah, spoilers for a book that's 100 years old. She cheats on her girlfriend to make her break up with her in the hopes that her girlfriend, who she loves and cares about, will go back to being normal. Yeah.
I do own that book.
Yeah.
But I
It's
keep
a
putting
real
it
downer.
off. Yeah, I keep putting it off because
Yeah.
it seems like a downer, and I don't know if I'm ever in the headspace for something like that. But that
Sure.
is interesting.
After that, you get The Price of Salt, Patricia Highsmith. You talked about that with Kelsey, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And then the first, like, what I would call modern lesbian romance, and by the conventions that we know, and I suppose love, is a book called Patience and Sarah, originally published as A Place for Us. And it sets the mold for, like, a lot of the historical books that I have read and that I'm happy to talk about, in that it frames the historical lesbian experience as, firstly, categorically butch femme, and with a passing woman, a woman who passes as male. And there's a lot of interesting discourse around that. The character of Sarah, for much of the book, is mistaken for a teenage runaway, like an apprentice who has run away from his master, and people act accordingly, like you would towards a 13-year-old boy who's run away from his job.
It seems like when looking at historical fiction, a lot of the books that I had found were very mask femme or mask passing
Yeah.
couplings. Because I know I read Backwards to Oregon, and then, of course, The Covert Captain,
Yeah.
which you had recommended. It just seems like that's kind of a recurring theme. And so, as you mentioned, like, thinking about Sapphic history, there aren't many narratives, but I wonder, like, how common that was historically as far as accuracy is concerned.
There is a really interesting historian. I think his name is Jason McCormick. He's a historian of specifically gender and sexuality, and specifically transmasculinity. And he has an interesting typology of what he refers to as like passing women, or I guess more inclusively, female-bodied people who lived as men. And he sets out like 3 reasons for it. The big 3. Firstly, you have monetary gain or adventure. The Mulan. You get And I think that's, you know, an interesting kind of niche. The second you get is for love. And you have a lot of these examples in these books. I don't think Backwards to Oregon is an example of this. I think it's an example of the third, which is female-bodied people who were men, lived as men, understood themselves as men.
Yeah.
That's kind of the only real problem I have with Backwards for Oregon, or Backwards to Oregon. It feels kind of transerasive in some ways. And that as soon as Luke's, you know, real gender is revealed, all of a sudden people default to a different set of pronouns. It seems kind of dismissive of trans realities, I guess.
I can definitely see that. I think that's where it gets a little tricky for me, because if you think about like our understanding of that time period, I feel like it is accurate that those people would erase that side of him a bit because it just wasn't something that they understood. But then, having been written from a modern gaze, I wonder how you like skirt that relationship or that way of telling that narrative.
We do have historical instances of people doing just that. The 2 most famous are probably Alexander Alexandrov, who was born Nadezhda Durov. He was a cavalry officer during the Napoleonic Wars, fighting for the Russian Empire, and he was awarded for gallantry and got some kind of, you know, plaudit from the Tsar. And the other, James Barry, I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, I don't think so.
He was a British surgeon. He was pretty high up in the British military. Like in the, I think it was the Peninsular. No, it wasn't the Peninsula. That was the Crimean War. He was a bigwig during the Crimean War, doing surgery in the field. And it was only discovered like after his death that he was female-bodied, but he lived his entire adult life as a man. And so like we do have these stories that we can draw on. But in some cases that was not, I don't know, there's a lot of doubt cast on these sort of like trans narratives. Another one was Albert Cashier, who was a Civil War soldier. He fought for the Union.
Interesting. Do historians know if anybody had found or under... I don't know how to word what I'm trying to say.
Their female anatomy.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
It's one of those where, like, that so often in the narratives that we have seen, like with Covert Captain and everything, it seems like that's kind of a point of drama a little bit, is having their female anatomy discovered. And I guess historically, are there those...
But there were a couple of court cases in, I want to say Sweden, where it's attested. In one of them, it was basically a shotgun wedding, and the man in the relationship was put up for it against his will because he was there and convenient. It only really came up when he was later put on trial, when it was discovered his not being born a man.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Usually when I hear shotgun weddings, I think like you have gotten somebody knocked up and she now needs to be married to stay
Somebody else got her knocked up. Somebody else got her knocked up, and
oh no.
This other person was roped in.
Oh my god, that's the story I want to hear.
The last woman executed for homosexuality by the Prussians was discovered, like, she had married another woman and had on her person when she was discovered a packer or strap-on.
No way.
And this was in the late 18th century, so.
I guess I did technically learn from a not super accurate historical fiction about the existence of strap-ons in that day and age.
Yeah, they've been around a while.
Of course, human beings will always find a way to have sex regardless.
Yeah. After her arrest, her wife claimed that she had no idea, which, I mean, that's a little doubtful.
I don't believe
but
that.
If it's like admit the truth or get killed, I mean, I suppose there's something to be said for deceit, but it seems a little low, you know.
So, speaking of that super inaccurate book, so, you know, giving a little lore to the listeners on our Sapphic Book Club, Bloomtown by Anna North is a very polarizing... Oh, yeah. Allie North. I can't even be bothered to remember her name. It's a pretty polarizing book in our group, and I know you and I fall on the same side.
Yeah, I fucking hate it. It's awful.
Okay. We've seen in our first little segment that you know quite a bit about history. I want to put it out there for our listeners. Why, from a historical aspect, do we hate this book?
I hate it on a multiplicity of levels. Like there are layers, you know, onion-like. You have like the baseline anachronism that it opens on a train that wasn't there for another 20 years. To start with, like that's not a great start. You have tokenistic representation of indigenous peoples, which is like very politically bad, as well as just like not even reckoning with the settler colonial history and the specific settler colonial project happening contemporarily to the book's time and place. It's in Utah in 1852, which was at the time a religious dictatorship under the rule of Brigham Young. Notorious polygamist and slaver. That's not a great place for any of that, and just not engaging with it at all seems to do a disservice to like the actual history of the place.
We both have a ton of reasons why we dislike it, but I did kind of wanted to touch on a little bit of the indigenous people, because I know within like the narrative of Backwards to Oregon, they also had the presence of indigenous people, and it seemed like they interacted within that book very differently than how JT and Joey and all of them interacted with indigenous people within that narrative.
Because like Backwards to Oregon is ultimately interacting with indigeneity and the sort of settler colonial project in a way that's historically precedented. You know, white people were not to be trusted because, quite frankly, they were a danger. If somebody didn't like the way an indigenous person looked and they were off on their own, they would just kill them very often. I mean, that's you know, the Plains buffalo was basically exterminated to try to starve the native peoples of the inland of this country.
Is that really why? Because I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was an attempt to annihilate their way of life, force them into reservations, and force them away from their armed rebellion against the settler colonial project of the mid-19th century United States.
Jesus Christ, I didn't realize that.
Yep.
We suck on more levels than I had realized previously.
Yeah, it's not great. And I think Bloomtown, in stark contrast, is a white savior narrative.
Elaborate on that, please.
Well, I mean, just in the way that, like, you know, JT or Joey or whatever you want to call her, earns their trust by doing something that, I forget if she like heals somebody or gets, she does something that heroizes her to them and is inducted into their tribe as like an honorary Indian, which again, white savior shit.
I know I had a lot of issues with it outside of historical
Of
accuracy,
course.
but I feel like I shouldn't just shit on the book that I dislike just to do it. But I
I mean,
will. It was
I
awful.
think I think it's deeply irresponsible to publish that kind of a narrative. That if you're going to publish a historical narrative, the whole project of historiography as a discipline is how we talk about history and how we interact with that, how we interact with those narratives. And it's just one of those things that going to kind of white savior, lazy historiography, not interacting with, you know, the baggage of settler colonialism, does tremendous disservice to, you know, the real victims of that project.
Okay, so now that we've shit on Bloomtown a little bit.
Yeah, we can shift gears.
Yeah, okay. So are there any books that you would recommend that you think are great depictions of historical fiction or like favorite books?
I loved Last Night at the Telegraph Club. I thought it was fantastic. Have you read it?
I have not. I had heard it was YA, and so I wasn't super excited about it.
I would describe it as coming of age literary fiction.
Okay.
It doesn't really follow like YA conventions. It's not.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a big YA reader. I think that a lot of times YA is condescending to the reader. Last Night at the Telegraph Club is great because it has this like very three-dimensional representation of the main character Lily. I think her name is Lily Who, H-U. So with Lily's story, you get a couple of different levels. You have ongoing the Red Scare, which is specifically ignited by the defeat of the nationalist Chinese in the Chinese Civil War, who later retreated to Taiwan, and the suspectness of all of the Chinese community where she lives in San Francisco. So you have that.
I was gonna say what era was that?
It takes place in the 1950s.
I'm not good with dates.
So it takes place during the second Red Scare. 1950s, you have this atmosphere of paranoia, and her family is targeted by some of this. So you have that backdrop. You have the historical butch femme community in the queer underground of San Francisco. It's one of those stories about Lily navigating her ethnic and sexual and real, like physical geography, and engages with kind of the queerness of the time. It features lesbian pulp, which is something that we don't really have much anymore because we have like actual queer literature. But lesbian pulp was always kind of there. But what made Patience and Sarah the first modern lesbian romance novel was that it ended happily. They ended up together and happy and sane. Where in lesbian pulp, to try to avoid any kind of like obscenity issues, it very often ended with one or both women insane and locked in a sanitarium, dead, or in straight relationships.
That is bleak.
The sort of stuff that grows out of the canon of Patience and Sarah. I think Backwards to Oregon is definitely in that canon. It again goes back to like this idea of there is a woman who passes as a man, and there's a woman who is comfortable and strong within her femininity, and the way that they complement each other in a society that would normally be hostile to them. You get, yeah, Backwards to Oregon is a great choice. Zuri Vaughn has a couple books that are probably like sort of lesser Backwards to Oregon in some ways.
Okay.
I mean, she writes exclusively butch femme. That's her niche. She is herself butch, and you know has some decent representation there. Her books specifically, Crossing the Wide Forever and Forever's Promise, are butch femme. The Devil trilogy by S.C. Wilson is also very much kind of in that canon. I don't know if it's self-consciously informed by it or if she's just like trying to cash in on the popularity of Backwards to Oregon, but here we are. Lighthouse Keeper by Eliza Linsky is a recent one. That features very much the same kind of dynamic, but I think the difference is that in Patience and Sarah versus like Backwards to Oregon, the more masculine character in Patience and Sarah understands herself to be a woman and lives as a woman privately and likes being a woman on some level in a way that Luke doesn't seem to.
It actually reminds me of, I don't remember the character's name in the sequel, but they're dating Tess. You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, that character, the Pinkerton.
Yes, the Pinkerton.
Yeah.
who
Just,
like
just
it
call her the Pinkerton.
privately, yeah, the
Yeah.
Pinkerton, who
Yeah.
privately lives as a woman but then represents herself as a man when it suits her, specifically like to do her job as a Pinkerton.
That's a very similar dynamic to The Perks of Living a Wallflower.
Hmm.
The more butch character in that one first introduces herself to the other main character, in the guise of a man.
Yeah, I feel like in Covert Captain,
Hmm.
Nathaniel Fleming would kind of fall into that category as well.
Definitely. I think so too. I mean, that's why I consider, that book to be in kind of the second category of passing women. The doing so for love. As you throughout Covert Captain, like Backwards to Oregon, you meet several of the captain's exes or encounter
Yeah.
them. And, it's messy, but ultimately like it seems like that's why Nora dresses as her brother and passes herself off as him. Because at base, her affinity is greater towards loving women than being.
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of that too just comes from that background of it seems like she came from a very abusive home as well.
Definitely, yeah.
And so the only way to kind of be free of that abuse was to be a man or
Yeah,
present as a man and get away from that family dynamic.
yeah, absolutely. I think that the big thing with Nathaniel slash Nora is that the primary concern is that she does not want to get married. She does not want to engage in what is expected and demanded of her. Her escape route is, yeah, passing as a man, which, puts her in. I mean, it really says something that she would rather literally go to war than risk getting married to a dude. Which, I mean, honestly, same.
It's choosing the bear.
Yeah. And I
I think it's interesting because if you think about like Nora versus Lucinda, and how they decided to live as men, both of them I feel like came to it through that same decision of I would rather go to war than to have to put up with this life that I'm heading towards, which in Luke's case was prostitution, and in Nora's case was dealing with an abusive family, getting married to a man and cranking out kids and just living in that sort of servitude. And I think it's interesting that they both came to it the same way, but the way they interacted and viewed themselves after they had begun living as men was very different, with Luke being more transmask and really identifying more as a man, whereas Nora or Nathaniel really came at it from the direction of I am a woman, but I am living as a man to just
yeah.
navigate the world.
I think with Nora, it's also telling that she has these spaces where she can be herself in the story. That like she has a very necessary like escape valve. Be that with, her various lovers from among the camp followers on campaign, or from her community in London, later Harriet.
Yeah. Whereas Luke really doesn't have that except for with Tess, and then eventually, was it Nora in that as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah, it was also
Okay.
Nora. Yeah.
I was gonna say, did I just make that up because
No.
we just were talking about a Nora? No, okay.
I think that with Luke though, he doesn't really need that. Nor does he particularly want it. Like he has sexual release with Tess, but he doesn't really need to like not be Luke. He's still Luke.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the sequel, there are mentions of things where I think even Nora wonders how Luke views himself, just because, like, there are those times where she talks about how, like, Luke will come and ask her, can you brush my hair? And those things that she associates with being more feminine. And it's kind of interesting how, like, Nora really tries to come at understanding Luke as a person, I think. Like, seeing that in the sequel, because you don't really see it that much in Backwards to Oregon, but,
Yeah, I mean,
with
Luke is
them
so
as
guarded.
the backdrop. Yeah, with the backdrop, you really get to look more into Luke and how Luke actually navigates understanding himself. And I think that's really something I enjoyed. Even though Hidden Truths, it's still a good book.
Not as good.
It's not as good, I would say, as Backwards to Oregon, but I do think that it's interesting in that it really takes the time to explore Luke and understand Luke and like compare and contrast how Luke is versus how his daughter is.
Definitely. And how
or the Pinkerton.
Yeah. And how like that kind of contrast kind of does play out, with his daughter taking after him in some ways, but not in others. And also having the freedom outside of that cycle of abuse to define herself.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely would say, for me, the sequel was more interesting in those dynamics and exploring what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man, and, like, how you conform to society's expectations and that exploration. Mm-hmm. But from, like, a purely narrative standpoint, I think I preferred Backwards to Oregon.
I would agree. I mean, Backwards to Oregon is just one of those, like, sweeping adventure stories.
It almost is a different genre feel
Mm-hmm.
to it than the sequel, even though the sequel is a continuation. I think you've even mentioned it in the book club, where the sequel is more straightforward romance versus you get more Western adventure tale from Backwards to Oregon.
Yeah, I would describe Hidden Truths as, like, Western-ish.
Western adjacent.
It has vibes. And I think, like, you know, most historical romance, when you really look at it, falls into, like, two categories. The vast majority of it that I've encountered is either Western or Regency.
That's true. I'm trying to think. I haven't read as much as you have. Regency, so, like, something like Fingersmith would fall under that, or...
Fingersmith's a little late for Regency. Fingersmith is, like, the 1870s, I think. But Regency is, like, the, like, Jane Austen era, you know?
Okay.
Jane Austen, Bronte sisters.
Would Covert Captain fall into Regency then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Covert Captain is Regency both in its narrative, like, you know, how it tells its story, and its language.
I did love the prose in that
it's great.
book.
It's so much fun.
I found myself just writing in that, like, very specific dialect for a little bit in our chat.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of affected in a way that's, like, really fun. She has another book. Well, it's not a book. She has, like, a 40-page novella. It's a prequel. It's a lot of fun.
Is it about the war?
It is about one of the, like, the side characters in London, the two older women. It's about them.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
One of them, they're on a privateer ship during I forget if it was during the 7 Years' War or during the Revolutionary War, but they're on a privateer ship.
Could be fun.
But it was too short. That's my only issue with it. It's like 40 pages long. It's like, I want more.
I mean, isn't that how it goes with a lot of good books? You always want more. Are there any other ones that you can think of? I know I recently read H.P. Munro's Silver Wings, which you had recommended, and I actually really enjoyed reading about the WASP unit. And I've started looking into that unit, and so I thought that was a really cool thing to see.
I really liked that book, although there are a lot of, like, just mechanical issues with it.
It was kind of interesting because Lily and
Helen
it was going through the WASP unit. And so for anyone who doesn't know what the WASP unit was, and you can correct me on any of my historical inaccuracies, but during the Second World War, for 2 years, I believe, or a little over 2 years, U.S. military, not having any men to spare for piloting jobs, decided that they would train women as civilians to fly planes where men were lacking, and kind of teach those courses. And so it follows Lily, Helen, and their unit as they kind of go through all that training. Obviously there's a love component, but I just thought it was really interesting learning about the WASP unit. And it was kind of wild to me to read it, because looking at it and looking into the history, it looked like they didn't even get acknowledged until like 2010.
It took a really long time.
Yeah. It looked like they got medals in 1984, which, you know, is 40 years after their service. And then they didn't even get considered part of the military until 2010, I think, Obama's presidency.
Yeah, it took a really long time to acknowledge them. And they filled a really vital role, because they weren't just flying. They were taking planes to where they needed to be staged to, like, actually go to war.
Yeah, and I think there was even a part where... and I read about this, so I do know this is historically accurate, where they were used as, like, targets for turret training.
They would tow target dummies, yeah.
That's insane! You're shooting at a plane with a human being in it, like,
well, it's
for
towed
practice.
behind.
I mean, yeah, but
still.
How accurate was a turret? And if you're training, like, your accuracy might not be that great. But,
for sure.
I mean, I just thought that was crazy to see that in, like, the 1940s, those women were doing, like, those crazy, like, dangerous jobs or vital jobs, like you said, doing maintenance runs to make sure that the planes that were supposed to go for the war effort were actually repaired
Yeah.
correctly. And then they're taking it up there to test it. And you're like, there's nothing that guarantees that this was fixed at all. And you're taking it up into the sky.
Risk. It's definitely a risk.
I gotta ask, because I feel like now I'm on Ask a Historian, basically.
I'm not that well read.
I think looking at that, just hearing about the women from that effort, do you know if there were any other, like, units like that potentially we could, like, look into, or...
There was the Air Transport Auxiliary, I think it was called, in the UK, the ATA, and they were women pilots. And there were several all-women units in the Soviet military during the time. The most famous one is the Night Witches, and their whole thing was they would fly Polikarpov PO2 biplanes that were really, really loud, and sometimes they do stuff to make them louder, like put rocks in the engine cabinet and all of that, and they would fly over, like, Nazi camps and bases and stuff during the middle of the night to fuck with them, specifically, to, like, keep them awake, keep them off-balanced, scare them. Sometimes they drop bombs on runways and stuff.
Oh my god, that's awesome. Torturous, but awesome.
Yeah, no, it's the Nazis deserve it. And then there were some dive bomber units as well. There were a lot of women involved in the Soviet war effort because it was a total war. It was a war of extermination against them. So yeah, back to the pilot stuff. Virgin Flight by E.V. Bancroft does cover the UK's ATA. It had some issues as a book. I think I gave it 3 stars. It wasn't bad. I mean, maybe 4. But yeah, there were some things that were lacking. A lot of representation for, you know, this kind of stuff, though, falls into these, like, myths that we have about history. These sort of ideas that we have that weren't necessarily always the case.
Such as?
So, like, one of the things with E.V. Bancroft's book is this idea that, like, I would call it femme-femme, and one of the plot points is sort of lavender marriage stuff, which did happen, but I think it is less likely to happen when you look at specifically very masculine coded roles like being a pilot. You know, there were a lot more allowances that were made for certain roles, and you see kind of a lot of queer women in the military historically, just because most of them are going to be rather unconventional if they're called towards that sort of thing.
Yeah. I guess thinking about lavender marriages, which you have stated did happen,
Yeah.
I guess I feel like I find that I have a harder time believing that they took place in more modern times, just because of how the gender roles and expectations from a marriage like that somehow felt like they went backwards almost.
I mean, they still happen, like, even today. You know, if you... One of my friends likes to look through, like, old gay news archives for, like, gay weeklies from various cities. And one of the things that you find in the 80s and even into the 90s are advertisements basically for lavender marriages. Gay men or lesbian women looking for the other gender's gay to partner up, and they often emphasize, like, straight passing. And yeah, the whole thing is that it is a way for them to advance within their careers and all of that, but it's not really something that's as common now.
Yeah. And I guess that's just, like, when I think about, like, the 50s, I think about, like, that stereotypical, like, the woman is supposed to be at home with the kids and they're supposed to be cranking them out. And so when I think about, like, lavender marriages, I just have such a hard time thinking how that would actually work within the confines of that historical era.
I mean, they had turkey basters.
Oh, no.
It's just one of those things where I think one of my favorite portrayals of the 50s in, like, queer literature, as well as the 60s and the 70s, is the book Stone Butch Blues. It's not a fun book. It is definitely a book that is very difficult. Leslie Feinberg, the author, is largely writing from her experiences as a butch woman who, for a while, lived as a man. It talks about the butch femme subculture of upstate New York, passing as a man for factory jobs, and, you know, the abuse that both butches and femmes faced at the hands of the police. There is sexual violence, once again, at the hands of the police. And you know, all of this is coming from... It's never lurid or, like, sensationalized. It's all... you know, presented pretty straight up. But it reflects a particular moment culturally that got us to where we are. The radical gay liberation movement and, you know, this sort of queer militancy that you can look at historically, but has been often, I think, very intentionally kind of either erased or co-opted by, like, Pride by MasterCard.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because It is such, like you said, it was such a huge moment in time, but it seems like when looking at like modern authors, so many authors either don't write about it or don't
Hmm.
know enough about it to write about it. And so I haven't seen as many modern day retellings of that era, which is crazy considering how important it was.
Definitely. There's a really bad one that I kind of can call out called The Beginning of Everything by Cara Malone, which in large part erases both the sort of ubiquity of butch femme relationships at the time and also the radicalism of the historical queer movement. It's one of those things where a lot of modern queer people are very kind of liberal in their orientation insofar as they've bought into capital and capitalism as an institution. So, you have a lot of historical radicalism, and there's a great lecture by Leslie Feinberg I recommend to so many people. I think it's called Beyond Pink or Blue, which is also taken from like the title of one of her later books. I did want to talk in reference to the queer radicalism historically. There was a book that I read maybe a month ago, maybe a little less, called Neon Roses.
You did bring that up in the book club.
Yeah, I was like effusively positive about it, I think. It's really fun. It's really good. It follows a like Welsh country girl named Elined and her self-discovery, we'll call it. She starts in a relationship with a guy, and it's set in 1985 during the big miners' strike they had in the UK. Her entire community is super reliant on the pits, the coal mines that are in Wales. Her entire town is built around it, and Margaret Thatcher was closing all of them. And so the miners went on strike, which meant that there was a lot of material insecurity because when they're on strike, they're not getting paid. And eventually, just Thatcher starved them out. And there's still a whole lot of animosity towards her for a lot of reasons, but that's one of the big ones. The way that she broke one of the biggest British unions just by starving them. And one of the interesting consequences, though, of this was that during this really long strike, you had a bunch of queer communists in London and some of the bigger cities in the UK getting together and forming this group called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, LGSM. And they would do these collections among their community and around their cities for people to give money to the miners to help them eat, to get them their necessities. And it's really, really interesting how you have these like rural communities that are often very kind of conservative in a way, building solidarity with these urban queer people.
Yeah.
And it's such a like beautiful story in a lot of ways, and it is very sad. But you had these communities when the AIDS crisis started to really hit the cities and these populations of gay men really hard. You had these communities show out and support them and do solidarity work. But that's kind of the backdrop of Neon Roses. Is you have Elined, who's kind of just not really happy with her life, get her entire world shaken by meeting June, who's a tiny butch lesbian from London. Elined refers to herself as a hefty lass.
Kind of love that.
I love like tall femme, tiny butch. It's fun. It's a fun dynamic. But it's a really fun story, and it is politically really good and kind of really explores the way that solidarity looks and how you can build these lines of affinity across fairly unlikely boundaries.
Yeah. That was 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It feels more recent than
I mean, it's more recent than 1821.
maybe that's why
Captain.
it's feeling more recent, but
Yeah.
I guess that brings up a question. How far back does it have to be considered historical fiction? Is
I
there
think
a
that's
time, or is it about like an importance?
it's about perspective, what you're doing to tell your story. Because a historical narrative, like telling historical fiction, is usually a frame device. It's a way that you can use a contingent time and place to tell a story that you couldn't necessarily tell with our current time and place.
Something like The Library by the River, which was told in 1980. I want to say 85 too. That wouldn't be historical fiction.
I think it counts, kind of. I mean, it's one of those things where it's pseudo-memoiristic. Like, it's a, at least at the time of writing, contemporary character reflecting on her own personal history, which, I don't know. Talk about a fucking cruel book.
Yeah. I mean, it was
Yeah.
The Price of Salt, but with a more upsetting ending.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, within that, like, it does bring up the homophobia of that day, and especially in the 80s, that talk of, you know, the AIDS epidemic is in the background of why the homophobia, it feels like it's at a peak within that time period. And so I was kind of curious what your thoughts were, just because, like, there, I feel like the era was a big part of a good amount of that narrative.
I think part of it, one of the things that I found disappointing was that they didn't touch very heavily on the AIDS epidemic or any of things like that, what was going on there. And
it was mentioned, but only insofar as to be like,
Yeah.
well, this is why gay people are,
and
quote unquote,
I think it's one of those things where, like, one of the issues that I have with a lot of these books is that they denude the historical narrative of historical context, where just being an open lesbian would be an extraordinarily, like, radical act and would often put you into a radical community. There are a lot of things that people talk about historically with, like, how we define, you know, who was a historical lesbian or whatever, who was historically gay. And you see that with, like, for example, the Sappho and her friend stuff. It's frustrating to a lot of people because, like, they won't just out and say, like, you know, so-and-so was a lesbian. Usually the sort of cop-out is that lesbianism or queerness or whatever as an identity formulation didn't exist. Like, they would not have thought of themselves as such contemporarily. And it's like, of course they didn't. They didn't have that, like, epistemic framework. They couldn't have understood themselves within this category that hadn't yet existed. But they had an experience that we would recognize today contemporarily as this thing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how historians seem so hesitant to put a label on, when I feel like some of these, like, historical figures just didn't put a label on it because the label did not exist.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
their lived experience and how they interacted with their world would dictate that we could
certainly
safely
now,
label.
yeah, certainly now that would be kind of unambiguous. But I think that kind of gets back to this, you know, history is a framework that we understand through narratives. Yeah, a lot of the narratives that we talk about are going to be those that were hegemonic culturally or politically. And I guess the hard work of it is finding history that is explaining the point of view of the subaltern, the minorities, the people who were the victims of that hegemony. One of the things that, like, really struck me with Neon Roses, though, is that, like, it has this very solid message of solidarity, and then it shows in the book rather than telling. Like, it has Eluned going to, you know, these places where she goes to a squat house full of lesbians. She sees the way that other queer women live, and there's a lot of political commentary about that. And I think that makes it a very strong book, because it's very much about, like, the both of the moment solidarity among queer people. And they talk about raising money for AIDS. That's one of the big things that she starts to do, and protesting for visibility and being loud and queer and unapologetic. But you also have, you know, the contemporary things that you can use that as a reference to. One of the things that June says towards the end of the book is she has something along the lines of, like, I don't think it's possible to be an individualist and be a lesbian.
Ooh, that's
an
interesting thought.
Yeah. She says you can't pull the ladder up behind you. So
And yet, we still have people who do that, so.
Yeah. I mean, it ultimately comes back to, like, I don't know, for me, questions of political economy. And there's so few, like, good representations of working class lesbians, and that's another thing that's great about, like, Stone Butch Blues, because it is a very self-consciously working class political book. Mm-hmm. But unlike Neon Roses, it's not a love story. It's not particularly uplifting. You know,
I mean, that's still an important story to tell.
So. Sure, absolutely. And I love Leslie Feinberg for telling it.
I'm gonna have to read it. I'm just gonna have to put myself in the mindset of being okay with being sad.
Yeah.
I think the thing that makes me more sad, though, is how rooted in history it is, and how real it is.
Yeah, and it has a lot of Feinberg's own experiences kind of woven into it. She wrote another book called Drag King Dreams, which I have not read, but I've heard very good things. But it's also quite, can be dark in parts.
I mean, I would assume so. Unfortunately, like, so many stories out there that fictionalize try to paint our queer history in less depressing ways, I feel like. And it's just sadly not what the history is. So I feel like if you are going to get one of those books that's more realistic or more accurate, it's it's not going to be super uplifting.
I think it's one of those things where you can prioritize different moments, because there are still historical moments of queer joy and queer triumph that we can look at. And, you know, ultimately, even if some of these stories aren't uplifting, we can organize to ensure that future generations or whatever, and people coming out today even, don't have to go through what, you know, these people went through, what some of us went through.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of, yeah.
I mean, isn't that the thing about learning history, though, so that you can try and learn from what has happened in the past and try and forge a better path? Well, yeah, thanks for coming on. All of this was really interesting. Where can people find you, Alex?
At goodreads.com/Manson_lamps.
Okay, so
It's
if you
fine.
guys enjoyed that episode, I definitely think we'll probably have Alex on again. But like us, subscribe. We're at the Sapphic Gaze podcast on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, and you can also find us on Goodreads. Any of the numerous books that we talked about on this episode will be on our Goodreads. We'll create a shelf for everyone, so you can find that there. And have a good day, night, week, month, year. Bye, guys.